In the last video, we talked about adding and subtracting positives and negatives, so now let's talk about multiplication and division. For a problem like 2 times 3, most people are pretty comfortable that this is equal to 6. But once again, what is this really telling us? What actually is multiplication? And essentially, a multiplication problem is an abbreviated way to do a repeated addition. Our 2 times 3 problem can be rewritten. It's essentially saying add 2 to itself 3 times. So we have a 2 plus 2 plus 2, which we know is equal to 6. What about something like 3 times 5? This is essentially saying add 3 together 5 times. So we have 3 plus 3, which is 6, plus 3 is 9, plus 3 is 12, plus 3 is 15, which we do know is 3 times 5. So this is just a shorthand for repeated addition. And we really want to use this because, for instance, if I have 27 times 241, we don't want to sit there and add 27 to itself 241 times. So this is why we have this kind of notation to make things a little bit easier for us. So now that we've discussed what this actually means, what happens when we introduce a negative sign? Negative 7 times 4. If we stick to the idea that we've been doing, this is saying add negative 7 to itself 4 times. And we know that adding a negative is the same thing as just subtracting. Since these are all the same, we know that we can just add them up. 7 plus 7 plus 7 plus 7 is 28. And then we keep the sign of negative since they're all negative to start with. So essentially, a negative times a positive is repeated subtraction, which is going to be negative. We're just adding up a bunch of negative numbers, so naturally it's going to be negative. So negative times positive is negative. What about if we switch the order? What if we do a positive times a negative? 4 times negative 7. On one hand, if you know the properties of real numbers, you know that multiplication is commutative, which means we can't just switch the order. And we just did that problem. However, what if we don't know that? Why is this true? Why is it that we can switch the order? Why is it still the same as before? Well, a 4 times a negative number, since we're multiplying by a negative, instead of repeated addition, we now want repeated subtraction. So I'm going to be subtracting 4 7 times. Since they're all negative, we just add them up, and 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4 is 28. Since they're all negative, we know this is going to be negative. So we see that a positive times the negative is a negative. If we have the negative number first, we're repeatedly adding negative numbers, which is going to be negative. And if the negative number is second, we're repeatedly subtracting numbers, so it should be negative. So either way, if we have two things of different sign, our answer will be negative. Let's do some examples. Negative 6 times 9. Well, we know that 6 times 9 is 54. And we know that here we have a negative and a positive. So my answer should be negative. What about something like 8 times negative 7? We know that 8 times 7 is 56, and we have a positive number and a negative number, so my answer should be negative. 8 times negative 8, well, we know that 8 times 8 is 64, and once again I have one positive and one negative, so this should be negative. Well, what about negative 8 times negative 8? If you remember, you may say, oh, this is going to be positive. We know that 2 negatives makes a positive. But the question is, why? Why is it that when we multiply these negatives, we get back to a positive? Let's think of what this is actually saying using our repeated addition or subtraction model. So essentially, we want to add negative 3 to itself, negative 3 times. And that second negative 3 here, since it's negative, we talked about, that means subtracting. So we're going to repeatedly subtract negative 3. So it looks like this. And we know that having two negatives next to each other is positive. So now we're at 3 plus 3 plus 3, which we know is 9. So we have a negative times a negative is a positive. Essentially, we're trying to repeatedly subtract a negative number, and subtracting a negative number is the same thing as addition. So we're going to be repeatedly adding a positive number, which should be positive.